After the release of Resident Evil 7, the game was a massive success both in terms of sales and critical reception. And thankfully, fans who were left wanting more after finishing the game in the first few days of its release weren't left waiting for very long, as much like what we saw with Resident Evil 5, Capcom already had a ton of DLC content planned for the few months after the game's release. These came in the form of 2 bundles of smaller DLCs, as well as an additional 2 premium story DLCs that would all be released in 2017, the same year of Resident Evil 7's initial release. In total, there would be 8 DLCs released within this period, meaning there was a ton of additional content for players who loved RE7, and also meaning that we have a lot to talk about today. So, were these DLCs actually any good? And of course, are they worth going back to and checking out today if you still haven't played them yet? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 25th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise in release order. You don't have to have seen the other videos in the series in order to enjoy this one, but I would of course recommend that you've seen my video on Resident Evil 7 proper if you're looking for more context on the main game or just my thoughts on it. So for those of you who are interested in checking out that or the rest of the series first, I'll have the full series playlist linked in the description below. But with that out of the way, like I said, we have a whopping 8 DLCs to talk about here, so similar to what I did when covering Resident Evil 5's large amount of DLC, we'll be splitting these each up into their own smaller segments and looking at them individually, while also assessing whether or not I would recommend them based on their price tag. The pricing will be a bit weird at times, because also like I mentioned before, most of these DLCs were actually sold in smaller packs where they were bundled together. So for these, we'll be taking a look at all of the individual DLCs within those packs on their own, and then talking about all of them together when assessing whether or not they're worth it for the price. And before starting, it's also worth mentioning that I have never played any of these DLCs prior to working on this video, aside from one of them, which I'll mention when we get there. So just assume that I'm experiencing everything here for the first time unless I say otherwise. Everyone got it? Good. Let's get things started then. The first DLC pack for Resident Evil 7 would be released on January 31st, 2017, exactly 1 week after the release of the base game. This pack is called Banned Footage Volume 1, with the theme of both this pack and the inevitable Banned Footage Volume 2 being that these are collections of tapes from other victims of the Baker family that we didn't get to see much of in the base game. Banned Footage Volume 1 contains 3 pieces of DLC content that we'll be looking at, with the first of these being the Nightmare DLC. Nightmare sees us playing as the world's unluckiest cameraman, Clancy Jarvis, who we played as during a couple of tapes briefly during the main game. In this Nightmare tape though, he's been taken down to the basement of the house after being captured by Jack at the end of the first tape we saw him in, and forced to hold out in the basement alone against hordes of molded for his survival. In terms of gameplay, this takes the form of Nightmare being a wave-based survival mode that sort of fills the role of RE7's Mercenaries mode. The game starts at midnight, with each wave being a full hour of in-game time, and the goal is to hold out and survive until 5 AM, at which point the Bakers will unlock the door to the main house and let you out. At the start of each game, the player will spawn with absolutely nothing in their inventory, but you do start out with a bit of scrap, and there's a crafting bench right next to where you start out. Using this bench allows you to create weapons, ammo, healing items, and even permanent upgrades to things like your maximum health, your movement speed, your weapon damage, and more, all for the cost of some of your scrap. Additionally, there are traps scattered throughout the basement like trip mine bombs and turrets that can be crafted in their set locations using your scrap, offering some cheap alternatives to weapons that will quickly pick off 1 or 2 molded if set up at the right time. But I know what you're probably wondering. How do you earn more scrap? Well, the player is able to find these compactors that are scattered throughout the map that, when activated, will produce scrap passively over time that can be collected by simply going over to it and collecting it. This seems really simple at first, but you'll actually have to move from one compactor to another in the middle of waves if you don't want to waste any of that scrap. And this is because each compactor has a maximum capacity for how much scrap it can hold, so if they hit that max capacity, they'll stop producing more of it until you come by to collect what's there. There's also a key item that can be crafted with scrap called Corrosive, that allows you to open up some locked doors in the basement and unlock more of the map to play in, which not only gives you more space to work with, but also allows you to find more compactors and increase your total scrap generation as long as you're able to keep running around between them. And as if that wasn't enough, there's also just an upgrade to the speed at which those compactors will generate their scrap, which can be a great purchase for those who are looking to increase their scrap output, as it will upgrade every compactor on the map with a single purchase. This all leads to there being a ton of strategy involved in how you want to spend your scrap over the course of a game. You can immediately invest a ton into things like weapons and ammo in the early game, and this will make you feel incredibly safe for a while, but it will also leave you without scrap to open up the map more or upgrade your compactors, meaning you'll be woefully underprepared for the later waves. It's a really interesting balancing act, and one that does make this mode feel surprisingly tense. And that's not even mentioning that every time you craft a specific ammo or a healing item, the price to craft that item will then increase, meaning the more that you use a specific resource over the course of one game, the more it will cost you to continue to use it later in the game. So while you could just make a really powerful build out of upgrading one specific weapon and just buying a ton of ammo for that, this will actually cost you a lot more over the course of a full game compared to just buying 2 or 3 weaker weapons and juggling ammo between them. So once again, it's a balancing act. Something else that's pretty interesting is that waves in this mode are actually time-based, with the game simply ensuring that a certain number of molded of certain types are spawned into the map at all times, but only requiring the player to survive long enough rather than kill every single enemy that spawns before the next wave. So the player simply has to hold out against these molded until that invisible timer runs out. And once it does, the game will either spawn a very large group of molded or a boss fight for the finale of the wave, and these encounters are the only ones that will require you to kill everything. The really fun catch with these boss encounters, though, is that they also turn off all of the compactors on the map, leaving you with nothing but the scrap and resources that you prepared ahead of time to actually deal with these fights. And in the event that you actually manage to survive them and complete the wave, you'll get a bonus scrap payment for that wave based on how many molded you killed throughout it, and an additional bonus is given for some of the harder boss fights. And this is kind of genius, because in case you haven't caught on already, Nightmare is less about just blasting through enemies, and more about just barely scraping by with as few resources as possible. So giving players a reward for defeating more enemies is really interesting, because it incentivizes more aggressive play for higher rewards, but if you get too aggressive, you'll be left with no remaining resources for the boss encounters, and inevitably just die. I actually experienced this pretty well firsthand, as my first attempt at Nightmare saw me investing a ton into healing items, weapons, and upgrades right off the bat, as I didn't really know what my options were, or how important upgrading my scrap generation would actually be. This led to me being really safe and feeling like an absolute expert in the early game, but left me incredibly broke in the late game. The last couple waves were incredibly intense for me, as I was left with no scrap, no ammo, and no healing items remaining against some of the hardest encounters that the developers could think to throw at me. Despite this, I somehow managed to just barely survive things like fighting 2 fat molded at once, and even a boss fight against Jack Baker with nothing but a knife. These were easily some of the most intense adrenaline rushes I've gotten from any of the RE games in this entire retrospective. And with a lot of focus and patience, I was actually able to survive my first ever attempt at the Nightmare minigame by doing this. Getting back on track though, completing a game of Nightmare, whether by winning like I did or by dying, will tally up your score for the run and add it to your total lifetime score for the mode. This lifetime score is then used to unlock some gameplay rewards that will make survival easier on subsequent runs, from increases to how much scrap you start with, to starting with healing items already in your inventory, to even new weapons and traps being made available for future runs. And for players who manage to complete a full run and survive long enough to be let out of the basement, there's an extra special reward available for you, a new, higher difficulty variant of the mode called Night Terror. This is essentially just the same thing, but all the enemies have their increased stats and aggression from the main game's Madhouse difficulty, and all of the compactors have had their scrap generation cut in half. So for players who have already learned how to easily conquer the base difficulty, this offers a great optional challenge if you're looking to get that same rush again. So if you couldn't tell, I loved the Nightmare DLC as a sort of highly replayable wave-based survival mode for Resident Evil 7, and I honestly see myself coming back to the game in the future just to play this mode and experiment with different builds and strategies. It was an incredibly strong start to my DLC experience, and this is still only just the first DLC of 8 that we have to cover today, which means that we're barely even getting started. The second DLC of Banned Footage Volume 1 is simply titled Bedroom. This DLC sees us playing as Clancy again after he's been freed from the basement, but now he's been restrained to a bed by Marguerite Baker, who's trying to convince him to eat his supper, which of course is her specialty. You know, the human organ stew that we saw in the main game. After she's left him to eat on his own, Clancy manages to get up from the bed, and we're tasked with escaping from the room without alerting Marguerite to the fact that we've escaped from our restraints. In terms of gameplay, this DLC is a lot simpler than Nightmare, with it playing out as a complex escape room puzzle similar to what we saw during Lucas's section of the base game. This one is considerably trickier to figure out though, and we also have to deal with the fact that whenever we make a loud noise, Marguerite is going to come in and check on us. When this happens, you'll have less than a minute to get everything in the room looking exactly how it did before she left, and lock yourself back into the bed to make it look like you were never up in the first place, which I actually thought added a pretty interesting twist on this puzzle in particular. If even one little thing is off about the room when Marguerite comes to check on you, she'll know that you were up and kill you for it, which adds a great layer of tension to the whole thing as you try to leave the room looking exactly as it did while solving the puzzle, making it almost feel like a stealth puzzle solving minigame of sorts. And Marguerite's suspicion whenever she came into the room had me on the edge of my seat every single time, just praying that she wouldn't notice that anything was off. It's a pretty well done little DLC, but there isn't too much to really talk about with this one. It's a single puzzle that will take you probably about 40 to 50 minutes to solve, and once you've solved it, there isn't really much replay value to it. So it's a nice addition, but not something that you'll keep coming back to like with the Nightmare DLC. The final piece of Banned Footage Volume 1 is the bonus mode Ethan Must Die. This is an incredibly difficult challenge run, similar to things like the Fourth Survivor or Tofu Survivor from Resident Evil 2. The player will spawn with nothing but a pocket knife in their inventory and be tasked with reaching the end of a set course through the Baker estate to escape. As you run through the gauntlet though, you'll find wooden boxes that have been randomly placed throughout the map, with each of them having their own rarity rating displayed above them in stars. The box's rarity determines what items can possibly be hidden within that box, meaning that not only are the items that you get in this mode totally randomized on every single run, but more valuable items will also be more rare than the less valuable ones. And some of these boxes will actually have a bomb hidden inside of them, which will kill the player instantly if they're hit by the explosion. This might sound incredibly unfair, and similar to most things about Ethan Must Die, it kind of is, but it's entirely by design, and does actually have a counter if you dedicate yourself to learning this mode. If you look closely at these boxes, you'll notice that the tape on them is actually wrapped around in a different pattern than the ones that have items in them, and if you get close to one and really listen, you can faintly hear the sound of the ticking bomb fuse inside of it. So while you might die to these a few times when initially trying to beat the mode, as it's just kind of hard to break the habit of going up and checking every box for an item, With enough dedication and perseverance, you'll start to recognize these boxes at a glance. And the enemies in this mode are no easier. They generally behave similar to the way that they do on Madhouse difficulty, but they've also had their damage output increased significantly, meaning that every single molded you come across here will either one-shot Ethan or put him into a critical state if an attack from them isn't guarded. On top of that, there are tons of traps throughout the gauntlet that will also one-shot Ethan if you're not being careful and keeping an eye out for them. These can be pretty frustrating at first, but both the traps and the enemies actually have set placements for every run, unlike the items. So even if you get killed by one unexpectedly, at least you've learned where they'll be next time. And when you inevitably die, as you will over and over again, a small figure will be dropped into your next run in the exact spot to mark your death. At first, this just seems like a fun way to taunt the player, but breaking this figure will actually drop you one random item that you had in your inventory when you died on your previous run. So if you had some really good stuff thanks to good RNG on your prior run, and managed to make it back to the point that you died at, you actually have a good chance at getting some of it back. All of this makes Ethan Must Die an incredibly difficult, but admittedly really fun challenge run. It's stupidly hard, so much so that dying over and over again is a guarantee rather than a possibility, but you really do learn a little bit with every single death. The true randomization of item placements and what you may or may not find between every run makes the mode play like a genuine roguelike as well, which I personally just really enjoyed. I spent a little over 2 hours trying to complete it, and while I got really close to the end a couple times, I just couldn't manage to finish it, and figured that I had already invested more than enough time into the mode to get a strong understanding of it. I'll definitely be coming back to finish this one someday, as it weirdly had me hooked for the entirety of those 2 hours. But if this video is going to get done in a reasonable amount of time, I just have to put Ethan Must Die off to the side for now. So to reiterate, everything that we've covered so far comes in the first banned footage DLC pack. This pack was priced at $10 USD on release, and is still sitting at that price point today. And while I know that this will vary a good bit depending on who you are, I personally felt like it was well worth that price tag. The Nightmare mode is awesome, and something that I genuinely look forward to going back and playing more of. I still have to go back and finish the Ethan Must Die mode sometime, as I really enjoyed my time spent with that as well. And while I wasn't as enthusiastic about the bedroom DLC, I feel like the other two pieces of content already justify the price for me. It should also be mentioned that I bought all of the DLC for this video during a recent Steam sale, so I actually personally spent $2.50 on all of this content rather than the full $10, so that only makes it even more worthwhile if you just wait for the Resident Evil franchise to go on sale. So as far as I'm concerned, we're off to a pretty great start. That being said though, let's get into the second DLC released for the game, Banned Footage Volume 2. This second pack was released another 2 weeks after the release of Banned Footage Volume 1, meaning that in terms of the release timeline, the base game itself has still only been out for 3 weeks at this point. And the format for this pack is exactly the same as the first, so we have 3 pieces of content to cover, with one being a totally new mode, one being a more puzzle-oriented DLC, and the last one being another piece of bonus content. The first of these, though, is simply titled 21. In 21, we play as Clancy yet again, this time following his escape from the bedroom. Shortly after escaping, he was caught by Lucas Baker and brought to the barn to play some games with other kidnapping victims of the Baker family. For the sake of this DLC, this takes the form of a simple game of blackjack, or 21 as it's also known. You and the other player have to draw cards in an attempt to add up to a total of 21, and whoever gets closer wins the round. But if you go over 21, you automatically lose. And in Lucas's twisted version of the game that we're playing here, we're not betting chips or money like normal. Rather, we're betting our fingers, as our hands have been strapped into some sort of finger guillotining contraption. This seems really simple at first, but honestly, the body horror in this DLC is weirdly effective, and I'm not even really sure if I'll be able to show off all of it thanks to YouTube's guidelines. But let it be known that I've physically cringed every single time Clancy or the opponent lost a finger, and only cringed even harder when they would lose multiple fingers at once. And even when you think you've won, Lucas always seems to have another trick up his sleeve here. Like playing another round after one of you runs out of all your fingers, where now you bet with electrocution, or maybe even one with a circular saw that gets closer to the head of the losing player with every round until it eventually reaches someone's head. There is a very surprising amount of effective tension and horror in this little Blackjack DLC, and honestly, I want to recommend that everyone play it just to feel what I'm talking about. It's not as simple as it initially seems from a gameplay standpoint either, as Lucas has also thrown in a new system here that he refers to as trump cards. These are cards that can be played at any time and have a wide variety of effects, from raising the bet of the opposing player, to discarding the last face-up card that you drew, to even just drawing a set specific card for your hand guaranteed. There are a ton of these trump cards with their own unique effects, and they really do add a ton of depth and strategy to the game, changing this from a simple game of luck to an intense mind game with the opponent. You also play with a set deck in this DLC, so counting cards to potentially get a leg up on the opponent is not only allowed here, but actively encouraged by Lucas himself. After players manage to survive the story mode component of this one though, a survival mode is unlocked that works very similarly to what we saw in the Nightmare DLC. You'll play using your 5 fingers for bets again, but the catch is that you'll now have to defeat 5 opponents in a row without losing all 5 of your fingers, with any lost fingers from one opponent carrying right over to the next. As you play through the survival mode, you'll also be able to complete a list of challenges that the developers put together, with each of these challenges adding a new trump card to your deck upon completion, further expanding your tools within the survival mode. And also similar to the Nightmare mode, once you manage to defeat all 5 opponents in one run, you'll unlock the Survival Plus mode, which is the same thing, except now you have to defeat 10 opponents in a row, and the opponents you go up against are much more difficult. You do bet with the electrocution machine this time though, instead of your fingers, so while 10 super difficult opponents in a row might seem daunting, you can lose up to 10 rounds before dying in this one instead of 5. So with some surprisingly fun and deep gameplay, along with a pretty fun story component and a fully fleshed out survival component, the 21 DLC is shockingly good. I know that this sort of thing will really come down to preference for a lot of people, but if you're down for a DLC that plays nothing like anything else in the Resident Evil series, I would definitely recommend this one just for how unique it is. The second DLC for Banned Footage Volume 2 is called Daughters. Daughters is a story DLC where we see the events of the night that the Baker family was first infected from the perspective of Zoe Baker, the daughter of the Baker family who managed to just barely avoid infection and who would eventually go on to contact Ethan and help him out throughout the main game. The gameplay in this one is really simple, just having a bit of stealth where you need to sneak around, and largely being a sequence of going from one bit of story to the next, much like the opening hour of the base game. But for a 20-minute story DLC, I still found it fairly enjoyable. It certainly doesn't offer much from a gameplay standpoint, but seeing things like Jack Baker trying to fight off his wife who had already turned, only to be infected himself, and then needing to run away from them and sneak around them from the perspective of a scared daughter who really just has no idea what's going on, is surprisingly effective. And at the very least, there are multiple endings to this DLC that are dependent on certain things you can do during your escape from the house. So for those who want to go back and see all the different ways that Zoe's fate could have played out, you'll be able to stretch this DLC from being about 20 minutes to maybe an hour or so. It's still not much, but as a smaller piece of main story content, I think it's pretty solid. And finally, we have Banned Footage Volume 2's bonus content, Jack's 55th birthday. This is another arcadey little side mode similar to Ethan Must Die, but this one is definitely a lot quirkier. We play as Mia Winters, who's running around different areas of the house to try to find Jack some food to eat for his 55th birthday party. There are a handful of different stages to run through, with all of them simply requiring you to find a bunch of food and bring it back to feed him, and you'll get a rank for each one of them depending on how quickly you can fill him up. As you collect the food, you'll also find ingredients like spices or sugar that can be combined with the main dishes you find in order to increase their effectiveness, meaning that there's actually some pretty intense inventory management here, since you'll want to maximize the effectiveness of every item, and the timer for your run won't pause while you're navigating your inventory trying to combine them. That's not even mentioning how small your inventory is here, or the fact that you have to use pretty much half of that space you do have to carry around some weapons, ammo, and healing items as well. You'll need these because there are also molded scattered throughout the stages that will try to attack you while you're rounding up the food. But this is surprisingly a good thing for the player, as every molded you kill will actually stop the timer from counting down for a few seconds, allowing you to use these enemies as a method of maximizing your remaining time and obtaining a higher rank, which again only adds to the quick-thinking inventory management of this minigame. Completing each stage with a certain rank will then net you some rewards that can be used on your future runs, from new weapons to even new skills that can be carried in your inventory which will buff you in certain ways, adding a solid reason to shoot for higher ranks and increasing the replayability of the mode a lot for those who end up enjoying it. I will say that Jack's 55th birthday wasn't really my thing, but I think it's a cute little piece of bonus content, and I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who really enjoy this one. So overall, my feelings on Banned Footage Volume 2 are a lot more mixed compared to Volume 1. I think the 21 DLC is great, and probably the second best piece of content we've covered in the video so far, falling just behind the Nightmare DLC for me. But the other two pieces of content here just left me a little underwhelmed. Daughters has some really great main story content that is absolutely mandatory for anyone who loves the story of Resident Evil 7. But like I said, it's only about 20 minutes long. And while I think that Jack's 55th birthday has some really neat design, I just personally didn't have a lot of fun with it. And now take into account that Banned Footage Volume 2 is actually more expensive than the first one, being priced at $15 USD rather than $10. Now again, I picked this up on sale for $3.74, so for how much I spent, it was easily worth it for 21 alone. But for the full price of $15, I probably wouldn't recommend Banned Footage Volume 2 to the majority of players out there. Of course, if it seems like any of the content here would be super worthwhile for you, then go for it, but I just wouldn't make that general recommendation the same way I did for Volume 1. But with those smaller packs covered, we only have 2 DLCs left to go, and these are those big premium story expansions that I mentioned earlier. And these actually came out on the same exact day, with both releasing on December 14th, 2017. Almost 1 year after RE7's initial release. The first of these 2 DLCs is called Not a Hero, and this was originally supposed to release in the spring of 2017, but was delayed to release alongside the final DLC, as Capcom wanted to take more time to polish it up and make it its own experience, as they just felt like it wasn't really coming together the way they'd hoped it would in time for its initial planned release. And I mentioned earlier that there was one DLC that I had played prior to this video, and Not a Hero is that DLC. I know that might seem a bit random as it's the 7th of the 8 DLC we're talking about here, but the reason for that is actually pretty simple. See, Not a Hero was given to every owner of Resident Evil 7 for free back when it came out, and still comes with any purchase of the standard edition of the game to this day. So if you own Resident Evil 7, you also already own Not a Hero, so when I replayed the game a few years ago just for fun, I decided to give this DLC a run through after finishing the main game. But I'm rambling a bit, so let's just get to talking about the DLC itself. In Not a Hero, we play as Chris Redfield immediately after he rescues Ethan at the end of the main game. Chris is sent in a joint operation between Blue Umbrella and the BSAA with the goal of apprehending Lucas Baker, who is revealed at the beginning of this DLC to have never actually been infected during the events of the base game, as he started working with the criminal bioweapons research organization that created the mold, the Connections, shortly after its arrival on the Baker's ranch, and the organization provided him with a serum to cure him of the infection so that they could effectively use him. So right off the bat, we're told that everything we saw of Lucas in the base game and throughout the other DLCs was not actually him being under the influence of some sort of bioweapon, but was actually just him being a genuine psychopathic sadist by his own nature, which honestly brings him up to being one of the most interesting antagonists in the entire series for me. Despite no longer being under the influence of the mold, he still just went along with everything that was happening because he simply enjoyed the chaos of it all and wanted an excuse to do all those horrific things to innocent people. That has to make him one of the most chilling antagonists we've seen from the series, if nothing else. He wasn't in it for the profits, he had no crazy plan of world domination or anything. He just wanted to be able to do the things that he did to totally innocent people for the hell of it. Getting back to the point though, Chris pursues Lucas into the salt mines beneath the Baker estate and ends up going much deeper into these mines than Ethan ever did. And eventually, he finds a hidden laboratory belonging to the Connections down here. This makes for a pretty fun setting for the DLC, and really does make it feel like the final stretch of a classic-era Resident Evil title, with us descending down into an underground lab and confronting the organization that's behind everything. In terms of gameplay, Not a Hero is basically just a 1.5 to 2 hour story expansion for the main game. So for the most part, it plays pretty much just like the normal Resident Evil 7 campaign, but there are definitely some key differences here. The biggest one is that this DLC is far more action-focused than the base game was, with Chris being sent in with a full kit, and obviously being a bit of a pro when it comes to dealing with bioweapons outbreaks. Not only are we given some incredibly powerful weapons that are totally new to this DLC, but ammo is also much more plentiful here, and Chris is even capable of using the classic shoot, stun, melee formula from the action horror RE games here. And let me tell you, he still has as mean a straight punch as ever. So where the end of RE7 already felt like it was starting to lean a bit into that RE4 design, Not a Hero just feels like Capcom going full RE4, but in a good way this time, and I'm always very pleasantly surprised by just how much fun this DLC is. They've even added some new enemy variants here that I think fit in really well with the tone of the DLC. These take the form of these new white mold enemies that can't be harmed by your standard small arms fire, as their bodies rapidly regenerate after taking damage, once again, much like the regenerators from RE4. So instead of using your standard munitions, you'll have to use a new form of enhanced handgun rounds called ramrods that burrow deep into the bodies of these molded and actively counter their regenerative abilities. It might not sound like much, but having a new enemy type that can only be killed in one specific way really shakes things up quite a bit in a DLC that's trying to be more focused on the combat, especially when you start throwing them in with groups of normal molded enemies and forcing the player to think on the fly about who they need to pick off first and how they're going to do so. They've also given Chris his own unique HUD here that's supposed to replicate the tactical display that's built into the visor of his helmet. And while this absolutely fits the theme of the DLC really well, I'm also just not a big fan of it. I massively prefer when the RE games just have a really minimal HUD that allows you to simply be immersed into the awesome environments and atmospheres that the artists and designers have crafted. And while I'm sure that some people will argue that this is immersive since it's technically what Chris is seeing, I still find that it takes me out of the overall atmosphere quite a bit. It does at least get rid of the awful blood overlay from the base game and replace it with a small health indicator in the bottom left corner of the screen though, so I don't entirely dislike it. Overall though, Not a Hero is definitely the best DLC we've covered in this video so far. It's roughly an hour and a half long, maybe a little longer if you're incredibly thorough and really exploring the environments in and out, wraps up the base game's story really well while filling out all of the lore of the bioweapons and such from the main game, and of course, allows players to take control of Chris Redfield once again. And at the low price of free, it's hard to not recommend that everyone who owns RE7 gives this a run after completing the main game. Because trust me, not only is it worth it from a gameplay perspective, but it will also answer almost every single lingering question that you're left with at the end of RE7. And finally, released on the same day and taking the role of the other premium story expansion for RE7, we have End of Zoe. End of Zoe sees us playing as Joe Baker, Jack Baker's older brother, as he happens upon some BSAA troops investigating in the swamp, which also leads him to find his niece Zoe Baker dying of infection. Not trusting these random soldiers who are in his swamp, he ends up capturing the BSAA troops he found and brings them and Zoe back to his home, where he learns everything that's going on by interrogating one of the soldiers, which leads to him setting out to fight back against the Molded and find a cure for Zoe no matter the cost. Because, as he says to this poor BSAA soldier, there is nothing that is going to get between him and his family. As far as the gameplay goes, much like Not a Hero, this is very similar to the base game, as it's more of a story expansion than a gimmicky side mode like a lot of the other DLCs. But if Resident Evil 7 was similar to RE 1 through 3 in tone, and Not a Hero was similar to RE 4 in tone, End of Zoe has gone full-blown RE 6. Joe Baker, quite frankly, just does not give a shit. He just goes in there and starts fighting Molded with his bare hands. And the funny part is, this large southern man is just so damn tough that he wins. Joe's main weapon throughout this DLC is legitimately just his bare hands, and the developers have given him a variety of combos that can be executed by throwing left or right punches in specific orders. On top of that, if you manage to stun a Molded by hitting it enough times to disorient it, you'll be able to execute a finisher, which more often than not means hitting it in the head so hard that it just explodes. And as if that wasn't enough, if you decide to take a stealthier approach, Joe is also able to instantly kill the Molded with stealth takedowns. So for most of this DLC, you'll be quite literally throwing hands with these 8-foot-tall bioweapons, which is absolutely insane, but also just really fun. And in case we hadn't jumped the shark enough times already, near the end of the DLC, Joe will actually find a goddamn experimental power gauntlet that Umbrella was planning on testing while cleaning up the Molded. So for the final sprint of the campaign, you get this awesome gauntlet that is capable of one-shotting even the largest Molded variants consistently, and it is just gloriously overpowered. That's not to say that there aren't still some other really awesome new weapons available in this DLC though, because even though you'll primarily just be using your hands, Joe is actually capable of crafting some entirely new pieces of equipment like throwing spears and homemade spike bombs that fit his character surprisingly well. He's not a hardened survivor, he's just an angry Louisiana man who's lived in the bayou his whole life and is doing everything he can to save his family. So these more primitive, hastily thrown together weapons actually fit him really well. And even more hilarious is Joe's new approach to healing. Now, first off, the blood overlay is back, which, while disappointing, makes sense since he doesn't have some in-universe alternative like Chris did in Not a Hero. But back to the point, as you go through the DLC, you'll be able to turn over rocks or tear bark off of trees to find various critters. You'll find things like centipedes, grubs, you name it. These can be combined with some chemicals in your inventory to make the same first aid meds that Ethan used in the main game. Or you could simply just press the healing button without any first aid meds in your inventory to simply pull one of these critters out and just munch it down for a small bit of health back. This is, again, very fitting for his character, and much like so much of the rest of this DLC, it just has this sort of silliness that you can't help but smile at. And much like Not a Hero, this DLC introduced some new enemies as well. The new enemy roster here is actually really good too. and honestly, is exactly the sort of thing that should have been in the base game. There's a new molded variant that's simply the blade armed molded, but with 2 blades and even more health, which admittedly is pretty lame. But then, you've also got these new mold-infected alligators that will lurk in the water and try to sneak up on you for an instant kill, or this new swamp monster type enemy that pops up throughout the DLC to fight Joe and almost acts as a sort of rival for him throughout, as neither of them can seem to kill each other. These new enemies feel way more visually distinct and interesting than any of the other enemy variations we've seen from any of RE7, and I just wish that it didn't take them this long to finally make some enemies like these. So in case you couldn't tell, I loved End of Zoe as well, and it's actually my favorite DLC out of the entire roster here. It's also only about an hour and a half long, but offers some really fun gameplay with tons of original content, and puts a nice bow on the Baker family's story, much like Not a Hero puts a nice bow on the overall lore of the game. So I definitely feel like it's worth playing, but I recognize that the $15 USD price tag might not be worth it for a lot of people. That being said though, I would highly recommend it when they're running a sale on Resident Evil content, as I only spent $3.74 on this one, which I think is more than worthwhile for some of the best content from an already pretty awesome game. So, shockingly, in a game with this much DLC and additional content, there's only one pack that I wouldn't personally recommend at full price, and even then, I definitely recommend it if you can catch it on sale. The team at Capcom managed to deliver such an awesome lineup of additional content for players who loved Resident Evil 7, with all of them together more than doubling the amount of playtime you'll get out of the game, while also offering a staggering amount of variety between them. This really is one of those times where I get to say that there's something here for everyone, and no matter what kind of gamer you are, there's at least one piece of content here that you're bound to fall in love with. I was really surprised by just how thoroughly I enjoyed playing through everything on offer here, and considering that you can buy all of the DLC for the game for a total of about $10 during franchise sales, and you don't even have to buy every single piece of it if certain packs or DLCs just don't interest you, I can wholeheartedly recommend that fans of RE7 go back and experience these if they haven't already. And above all else, trust me, you have to check out that Nightmare mode. With a few more maps and some slightly deeper systems, this would have been the best side mode in the Resident Evil franchise by a mile. So at the end of the day, I'll give Resident Evil 7's DLC a rating of absolutely go and check out anything here that caught your interest. That's going to wrap up this video, but do be sure to check out my other Resident Evil videos if you haven't already, or if you're looking to branch out a bit, maybe check out the series I've been doing where I'm playing every Yakuza game for the first time. Thank you for watching, and of course, a very special thank you to our channel members and patrons who make series like this one possible. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and help me out with the algorithm, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one, and I'll hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.